Hello, good morning. My name is Karen Larson. I am a program officer here at the Chicago Council on Global Affairs. Thanks to all, but a special thanks to our members for joining us this morning via Zoom for a conversation around the future of defense policy in a new decade. This program is part of our America in 2020 series. Throughout the fall, the Council and the Financial Times are hosting a series of discussions on foreign policy topics central to the 2020 United States presidential election. As voters confront different foreign policy worldviews, the series convenes influential voices with distinct perspectives to examine issues with far-reaching implications for America's future. We would like to thank the Financial Times for their partnership in facilitating this programming series, and do hope you can join us for upcoming conversations on the future of US-China relations, the Middle East, international economy and trade, as well as COVID-19. And before we hand you off to our moderator and our panelists, please note that the Council is an independent and nonpartisan platform, and the views expressed by the individuals we host are their own and do not represent institutional views or positions by the Council. This program is part of the Lester Crown Center on U.S. Foreign Policy. A generous gift from the Crown family supports all of the Center's efforts and the development of digital resources to make the Council's foreign policy content more accessible across our platforms. And lastly, if you have a question for the panel, we will be taking audience questions later on at ccga.live. So if you'd like to ask a question, simply enter ccga.live, that's ccga.live, into your web browser, follow the on-screen prompts, and you'll be able to submit or vote for your favorite question there. And with that, I'm going to hand the reins over here to our moderator, Peter Spiegel, who is the U.S. Managing Editor of the Financial Times.
Thank you, Karen, and it is my great pleasure to be kicking off this America in 2020 series, again, joint venture by the Chicago Council and the FT. I am Peter Spiegel, U.S. Managing Editor of the Financial Times, but more importantly, I spent 8 years after September 11th covering the Pentagon and U.S. military abroad in Iraq and Afghanistan. So I do have some background in the topic. I am very honored to be in the same virtual room with really two of the leading military intellectuals we have in the U.S. Andrew Bacevich is currently with the Washington think tank of the Quincy Institute for Responsible Statecraft, but has a long academic career, most recently is Professor Emeritus at Boston University, but also is a retired Army colonel, went to West Point, has written more than a dozen books on military affairs and military history. And I would, Andrew, you may disagree with me, I think a self-described Catholic conservative, little c conservative, but I think Andrew is best known for being a critic of what some have regarded military adventurism since September 11th. I'm also very happy to be joined with another leading military intellectual, Christine Wormuth, who's now at RAND. She is head of the International Security and Defense Policy Center there, but she has a long and distinguished career in government, particularly at the Pentagon, served a long time at OSD, Office of Secretary of Defense under Secretaries Perry, Cohn, and Rumsfeld as a civilian, but more recently was a political appointee through the Obama administration, both in the Security Council and at the Pentagon, finishing up 2 years as Undersecretary for Policy, which is generally regarded as the #3 job at the Pentagon. So thank you very much for joining us. To both of you, it's an honor to share the same screen with you two. I want to start with sort of a 30,000 foot look at threats and force structure, because I think sometimes we plow into issues of the day without taking the step back necessary to think about how we spend our money, how we are structured to meet current threats. Let me start with the Chicago Council very helpfully has done a survey of American public opinion and foreign policy that goes through what Americans see as the biggest threats. Number one, at least non-COVID, not domestic unrest related, sort of the traditional foreign policy ones, is China's emergence as a world power. 55% see that as a threat to the U.S. Real partisan differences there, though. 67% of Republicans see China as a threat, while only 47% of Democrats. Sort of ticking down, again, the more traditional foreign policy and defense policy potential threats: international terrorism at 54%, North Korean nuclear program at 51%, the Iran nuclear program at 49%, and Russia is placed in the world at 45%. Again, most sort of bipartisan agreement on that, except for on Russia, where, again, sort of the reverse of what we saw in China. 57% of Democrats saw Russia as a threat, or only 40% of Republicans. So that's the threats as seen by the American people. If I could start with both of you, Christine, why don't we start with you, because I know you worked on the Quadrennial Defense Review when you were within the Obama administration. And take us through your thoughts on how we are currently structured and whether we're heading the right direction. Again, sort of for those who don't follow these that closely, and again, this is going to be oversimplification, but sort of since September 11th, we've gone gradually, for some, perhaps not too quickly enough for others, from a sort of Cold War posture, maneuver warfare on land, blue water navy, and sort of traditional air-to-air superiority in the Air Force, to a more, I guess, counterinsurgency, coin posture where we have, far more emphasis on special operations forces on land, counterinsurgency strategy on land, brown water littoral combat with the Navy, and then a lot of ISR and unmanned when you talk about the Air Force in terms of reconnaissance and surveillance. Christine, let me start with you. Given that we are now seeing, as our poll suggested, the rise of state actors again, China and Russia being the most two obvious, but Iran and North Korea as well, do we need to keep moving in that direction towards, I guess, more of a deployable, more counterinsurgency focused military? I saw the Marine Corps commandant recently said he wants to get rid of all his tanks. Or do we have to start rethinking that a bit and getting back to sort of more traditional structures in our armed forces in terms of investment in the budget and structure within the force? Christine, I think you're still on mute.
Apologies. I think the Department of Defense has a lot of work to do, frankly, to be able to compete successfully against China in particular and Russia to a certain degree, as well as be able to, I like to say walk and chew gum. We also do have to deal with the North Korean weapons program, malign behavior from Iran, et cetera. So there's a lot of work to be done. And here's why I think the Pentagon has a problem. First of all, as you said, Peter, for the last 20 years, the department and our military has been heavily focused on counterinsurgency, counterterrorism in the Middle East and Afghanistan. And during that time, China in particular has been aggressively modernizing its military. President Xi has said, the Chinese military needs to be a world-class power by 2050. And in the last 20 years, the Chinese and the Russians, to some degree, have been investing very heavily in advanced precision standoff weapon systems that both greatly expand their ability to project power away from their shores and also their ability to prevent the United States potentially from being able to get as close to their territory as we would need to do during a conflict, which I think it's important to say, we don't want a war with China. We don't want a war with Russia. The best way to avoid that is to have the capabilities that show that, we could prevail in that kind of conflict so that we deter it. But we really do, our whole power projection model has been focused on being able to project forces out of the United States to establish air superiority, information superiority, and then to be able to bring forces into regions to base close to where the conflict is, and then use precision weapon systems to achieve our combat objectives. And the Chinese and the Russians have been steadily developing systems to pick away at those nodes of our force projection plan, and now have a lot of systems that make that traditional power projection model that the United States has used, what a lot of intellectuals call the American way of war. That model is really under assault right now. So I think there's a lot that the United States needs to do to sort of move the cruise ship of the Department of Defense. But I also want to step back and say that I believe that the most important parts of competing with China in particular are not in the military dimension. It's the economic dimension. It's maintaining our competitiveness and maintaining our ability as a country to be innovative. And frankly, restoring a lot of our non-military tools of power, our diplomatic strength, for example, our soft power strength. So as much as I think there's a lot of work to do on the military side, very important work also needs to be done in other areas of American power.
Andrew, let me just sort of ask you the same question, and whether you agree with Christine on this, because what Christine is describing is a pretty significant investment in trying to transform the way we do things. Is there, frankly, the budget for that? We're trying to maintain a force that is both expeditionary, that can deal with sort of non-traditional threats, but also the rise of a much more traditional state-sponsored military. Is that something we can afford to do, and is that something you think you would advocate? And I just warn you, you're also on mute.
Well, you wanted to talk at 30,000 feet. In a way, I think I'd go up to 50,000 feet. And what I mean by that is Christine's description of geopolitical threats is one that I would subscribe to. You know, and it's pretty easy. It's obvious. You know, you got China, you got Russia, you got Korea. All of these are geopolitical problems for us. I'm not sure that those threats are the ones that pose the greatest danger to our way of life, to our safety here at home, to our prosperity, to the integrity of our political system. And I think that the events of 2020 very much call our attention to a different array of threats, which relate to public health, which relate to climate change, which relate to the integrity of our borders. Now, there has been some recognition with regard to all of these things that somehow or other these impinge on national security, but they've been treated as secondary concerns. You know, the big concern is let's fight a 20-year war in Afghanistan and a war a decade longer in Iraq. So I think that we really need a conversation that goes beyond an assessment of geopolitical conditions to a broader consideration of non-traditional concerns that, if taken seriously, would, I think, lead to a radical redistribution of resources related to national security. So, you know, maybe we don't need as big an air force. Maybe we need more airplanes in the Forest Service, so we can do a better job of putting out forest fires. Maybe we don't need more aircraft carriers. Maybe we actually ought to be investing more money in the Coast Guard with all of its multiple functions that relate to our security. So I don't see any likelihood that the conversation I'm proposing is going to happen in Washington, because I think that the existing paradigm that Christine described is deeply embedded. But my view is we need a new conversation.
But let me ask you sort of the consequences of that. And, you know, if we did in some ways scale back the military spending to redeploy that towards, you know, the homeland and public health and whatnot, there are still those more traditional threats out there, be it global terrorism, be it China, the rise of China. Is there not a risk if you're redeploying those resources that the more geopolitical of these threats?
Of course. I mean, of course, there's a risk, and as a risk is if we focus on this looming Cold War with China and treat that as the biggest national security problem we have, then there's a risk that we're going to pay too little attention to climate change, and that's going to bite us in the butt. So yes, of course, there has to be some kind of a balance. I'm in the school that says that balance has been too heavily tilted toward considering national security through that traditional lens, which tends to see problems as military problems, and tends to want to have more military resources available to address that problem. You know, I guess you don't want to talk about the post 9/11 period. I mean, that's not sort of on our agenda, but you know, there we were responding to 9/11, responding to a problem where we said the problem is terrorism, and we responded by invading and occupying countries at a time when we took for granted the military supremacy of the United States of America. Iraq and Afghanistan, neither one, by any measure, to my mind, can be described as a successful undertaking. Indeed, I call them both failures. And I think that there are enormously important lessons to be taken from those two wars, the foremost of which is, don't kid yourself to think that possessing and using military power is the best way to provide for the well-being of the American people.
Christine, I think there's maybe not as much agreement as there may appear here, because you did, when you talked about China, say that the more important aspects of our policy there have to be soft power, diplomatic, economic. But I'm just wondering if you could take what Andrew was saying and grapple with it a bit. I think we again, even just going to the Chicago Council survey, issues of public health and frankly domestic terrorism, even right-wing terrorism, were higher on the list than some of these other threats that I ticked off, more traditional threats that I ticked off at the start. Follow this through. I mean, what are the consequences? Because I just to play devil's advocate here slightly, if you were to go to Beijing and talk to the Chinese military, they clearly see themselves and their priority as matching, if not overpowering the U.S. in the Pacific, or supplanting the U.S. as the primary Pacific power. So there is a trade-off here, and I guess having been in government and tried to make some of these trade-offs, at the Pentagon. I remember Secretary Gates always saying, one aircraft carrier group has as much personnel as the State Department. How difficult is it within the system to make that argument? And do you agree with that argument that we have to redeploy resources from traditional military spending to some of these other issues that Andrew has raised?
I'm not as far over, I would say. I don't know which direction I would point into where Andrew is, but while I perhaps wouldn't endorse quite the radical approach that Andrew is laying out, I agree that we have over-militarized our foreign policy, which has had a variety of consequences, to include, frankly, overlooking the very clear, global threats to our security and security of the entire world, of things like the current pandemic that we're experiencing or climate change. So I would agree that we need to rebalance within our national power toolkit. And certainly as a policymaker, I found us reaching frequently for the military tool when it perhaps was not the most appropriate tool. And I think that there are a variety of reasons for that. The American military, as Andrew knows well, having served in the U.S. Army, is an incredibly competent institution with a can-do, mission and esprit de corps. It's incredibly powerful. Even if strategically we may not be winning, tactically it's often very successful. And so I think it's very tempting for people sitting in the Situation Room to reach for that military instrument in a whole bunch of different settings, particularly when, unfortunately, tools like our Foreign Service, for example, are have atrophied and have been underinvested in for so many years. So I agree that we need to have a rebalancing. I don't think, however, that it would be wise to make major shifts in terms of budget share, for example, away from the Department of Defense to something like Health and Human Services to build up the public health system. Because while we do need to deal with climate change and we do need to deal with global health security challenges, we also, again, need to be able to walk and chew gum. The Chinese, I think, are, at a minimum, very interested in establishing themselves as the hegemon in Asia. And the Russians are clearly, willing to be aggressive in a variety of different ways. And I think we have to be able to grapple with that using somewhat traditional military tools at the same time that we start doing more to deal with climate change. Now, I do think clearly we're in an era of finite resources, and the pandemic and the economic recession that we're in right now are going to put, significant downward pressure, I think, on the Defense Department budget as well as the broader federal budget, given, all of the trillions of dollars we've spent on COVID relief. So there are going to be very hard choices ahead, both, within the Department of Defense, what we're going to invest in and what we're going to shed, but then also among different other parts of the government and where we need to make investments. And so I think that the next, 4 to 8 years that the United States is entering in is a really profound moment where we are either going to come together and rise to make these difficult choices, or we're going to continue to sort of drift and let sort of inertia, govern how we structure ourselves. And I think, in that situation, the United States runs the risk of sort of fading into sort of being more of a middle tier country, which I don't think most Americans want.
And Christine, can I stick with you and specifically talk a bit more about China? Because I was struck in your opening remarks about your view, which is I think is widely shared, that the Chinese have gotten better at disrupting what has become the American way of war. We do have, what many regard as vital national interests in the region, from treaty allies in Korea and Japan to, at least legally, the Taiwan Act forces us to defend Taiwan as well. Security of the commons, there's all sorts of American interests there. What would you say the U.S. has to do to counter what you have said is sort of China's ability to sort of get to ping some of these points where the U.S. has based its strategic projection in that region?
Well, where do I start? There's a lot that we have to do. I think, first of all, again, going back to my view that this competition with China should not be primarily a military one, but should be multidimensional. I think we really need to sit down. One comparative advantage the United States has relative to China is the network of alliances and partnerships that we've built up over the last 75 years. So I think first we need to come together with our allies and partners, both in Asia, but also in other places like Europe, and really try to develop together a comprehensive strategy for competing with China. And I very intentionally use the word compete and competition rather than Cold War. I don't think it would be wise to think about the US-China relationship as sort of a new Cold War. Among other things, there are areas where we need to be able to cooperate with China, if at all possible. Again, to Andrew's point, we're in this climate change mess together, and we're not going to get out of it if we don't work with China. Ditto for things like global health threats, something that we have a vested interest and a shared interest with the Chinese. So we need a comprehensive strategy. And then if you want to, narrow it a little bit more to the military piece, we need to, again, I think, adapt and sort of evolve our military posture in the Indo-Pacific to be better able to allow us to kind of deter Chinese aggression in the South China Sea, for example. So, we are very heavily focused in terms of our bases and installations in Asia, in Northeast Asia, Japan, Korea. We need to continue to have a footprint there, but we also need to have more of a footprint in Southeast Asia. So there's some rebalancing of our military footprint in the region that needs to happen. Then you turn to capabilities. And I think, here we need to have, again, weapon systems that have much more of a standoff range so that we can basically, be able to fight and to be able to put forces into the region, staying out of the threat rings of the very long range missiles that China has invested in great numbers, and they have now very sophisticated capabilities. We need to do much more, I think, to invest in cyber capabilities. The Chinese have very sophisticated cyber capabilities that could, not only be disruptive in Asia, but also, frankly, here in the United States homeland. And that's certainly true for the Russians. I mean, some of these anti-access area denial capabilities that the Chinese have, the Russians have as well. And, something that isn't talked about very much, I think, but is also an important part of being better postured to deal with Russia and China going forward is our homeland defense. We have been saying for a long time, America is no longer a sanctuary, particularly after 9/11. But in terms of how we actually think about operating, we essentially have continued to think about us being, unreachable here at home. And that is no longer true, particularly when it comes to cyber attacks here at home on communication systems, on critical infrastructure. So those are just, I think, a few things that we would need to do to be better positioned to shore up deterrence.
Andrew, let me pick up at what Christine said and throw it at you, which is the role of allies in the region, because I think frankly, administration, Republican and Democrat, have for decades tried to get our Asian allies to work more together to help the common defense there. It's never, frankly, happened. But we've seen the Trump administration and the president himself really hammer home on the Koreans in particular, that they have to pay more of their fair share. Prime Minister Abe, of course, who's just handed over the reins, spent a lot of his term trying to change the Japanese constitution to raise the amount of spending they can do on defense spending. If you are advocating a shift in resources from the Pentagon to other national priorities, is that a way to square that circle? Is that a way to ensure that the U.S. Security issues in the region are still being met at a time we're trying to deal with other crises? And you're on mute still.
So your question is, can we bring about a possible redistribution of resources by getting our Asian allies to do more?
How do we meet the threat of China with your advocacy for shifting resources?
I think I'd shift the conversation slightly and say, well, if we're looking for freeing up resources, rather than leaning on our Asian partners, let's lean on our European partners. I mean, this gets to the question of NATO, and how is it that 70 some years after World War II, the United States is called upon to ensure the security of a Europe which is now, to use the phrase favored by some in Washington, whole and free, and stable and prosperous. So to my mind, there is a need to reassess alliance commitments. I would begin with our commitment to Europe. I would be far more cautious about making any serious changes to our force posture in Asia, because despite what I said in my last chance to talk, yes, of course, China is a competitor. And that competition is going to continue through the 21st century, I expect. I think that, and Christine referenced some of this, what we need to do is to find a way to change the conversation with China, to nudge it away from defining our relationship, the bilateral relationship, in terms of competitive military terms, and nudge it in a direction where we focus on our common threats. And as Christine suggested, and I certainly believe this, the common threat of climate change is going to become more and more and more serious. And we and the Chinese absolutely have to cooperate in dealing with that matter, or we will both end up being fried. So I wouldn't put changing the basic U.S. military alignment in Asia at the top of my to-do list.
Let me press you though then on NATO, because one of the questions, and I'm going to start going to the questions very quickly from the audience, is are our alliances an asset or a liability? And I think, I don't want to put words in your mouth, but if I'm understanding you correctly, you're sort of calling for a reassessment about NATO writ large, whether it serves its purpose currently. And is that also something that would, in terms of shifting resources, you'd be less committed to Europe? Is that what you're saying?
Absolutely. I mean, in other words, if I think NATO is a wonderful idea, I don't think the United States is required to provide for European security at this point. Now, they will continue to be free riders as long as we allow them to be free riders. And I don't blame them for that. So we're going to have to play a little bit of hardball and say, hey, man, 10 years from now, we're out. So you, our European friends, you now have a decade to figure out how you are going to provide for your own collective security. And I think a decade gives them plenty of time to do that. And we need to then follow through on that promise.
Christine, let me ask you to address that, because again, going to our friends at Chicago Council and their survey American Public Opinion, surprisingly to me, still quite a bit of support for alliances writ large, and particularly in Europe. I think 61%, if I'm reading my notes correctly, said that they think European alliances are in the benefit both the U.S. and Europe, and another 7% said it's better for the U.S. So that's a total of about 2/3 of Americans are supportive of European alliances. I mean, this is something we've been dealing with since the end of the Cold War, NATO's relevance, and they've tried very hard to show with out-area operations around the world that they can be more relevant. But why don't you deal with Andrew's contention here, because it's not an outside the mainstream. Certainly, President Trump has been arguing this for much of the last 4 years. But again, Secretary Gates argued this under the Obama administration. This is something that goes back to the Bush administration as well. That the European allies do not pay their fair share. Very few meet their 2% target. Is this something we need to reevaluate in the current environment, whether NATO is still fit for purpose? As a defender of NATO, let me just say, I remember Donald Rumsfeld once saying, if we didn't have NATO and we came from outer space, we'd have to invent it. But I'm just curious your view on this.
Well, I think there's a big difference between requiring the Europeans to pay more towards their own defense and to do more in terms of investing in their own military capabilities and getting out of NATO. I think we absolutely should continue to press the Europeans to meet the pledge that they put in the Wales Summit to basically have 2% of their GDP at a minimum be invested in defense by 2024. And a number of NATO countries are at that target. Several others are on their way, and there are others that are not as far along as we'd like them to be. And there's the free rider problem is real. But when you look at the U.S. defense budget is as large as it is, not because we're paying to be in NATO or paying for European security. We have a global military, and the United States has chosen to essentially have, has envisioned it providing for its own security as a requirement that meant that we were going to take on global responsibilities. So even if we weren't in NATO, we would still, I think, have a very large and somewhat costly U.S. military. And in my view, the benefits of NATO membership are far greater than the downside. So I do not agree with sort of an idea of saying to the Europeans, you've got 10 years to kind of get your house in order or we're pulling out. But I absolutely think we should continue to press them hard to invest more. And I think we should say, look, we all agree that China is the real challenge for us here. And to be able to shore up deterrence in Asia the way we need to, we're going to have to do some rebalancing. And that means you guys are going to have to do more in your own backyard. And I think part of what we have to do is make the case for why that's in the Europeans' interest. And that's been, a long conversation that's been ongoing for some time. And we're not where we need to be. But certainly since Russia went into Ukraine in 2014, that's when you really started seeing some of the European countries spend more on defense because they could see in a very clear way how this was a threat to their own security.
I remember I was in Brussels when Kirk Campbell came through town trying to get the Europeans interested in Asia, and they were not interested. Andrew, go ahead.
Yeah, but there is, to my mind, a grand strategic rationale for doing what I just proposed. And the grand strategic rationale goes back to the question of what the hell is it we're trying to do? I mean, is it our purpose to be the global hegemon? Is it our purpose in perpetuity to maintain military power that can be deployed around the world? I don't think so. I think our purpose, in the largest sense, is to bring about the creation of an international order of states that can more or less live with one another, enjoy freedom, pursue democracy. And guess what? That's what we have achieved in Europe since 1945. We have accomplished our mission. And I think it would be a good thing for us to say so. We're done. This is what we would like to see happen elsewhere. But here is an illustration that we can, in fact, achieve this purpose, and that when we do, we get out of the way and let nations, manage their own affairs. So it's much more than simply sort of a dollars and cents in the distribution of Pentagon resources, in my view.
Let me go, for those of you, again, who like to participate in asking questions, the website is ccga for Chicago Council on Global Affairs.live. Let me bring up a topic which we haven't discussed yet, North Korea. Question from the audience. North Korea has long been a threat to the United States. How seriously is the U.S. thinking about the North Korean threat, and how much is it prepared for it? Obviously, things have changed over the last 4 years where Donald Trump at least perceives a new personal relationship with Kim Jong-un and has sort of discouraged joint exercises with the South Koreans. Just curious, Andrew, let me start with you on this one, whether that is, you think, a fruitful approach. Obviously, the approaches of our previous administrations have been not so fruitful. Is there anything new or different on the horizon about how to deal with the North Korean threat? I'm sorry, you're on mute again.
Sorry. President Trump has demonstrated his naivete, I think, in his imagining that he can establish this personal relationship with Kim and that all problems will therefore be solved. I mean, I think my views on Korea are very conventional, that the North Korean regime is absolutely concerned about continuing its existence. They believe that nuclear weapons provide some sort of a security blanket. But I also think that, and many others have made this point, that the solution to the problem, if there's a solution, really is going to come by dealing with China. And that this is yet another example of why allowing the US-China relationship to be defined in terms of a military competition is actually going to end up being detrimental to our own security. Somehow or other, we've got to, and I understand how much effort has been invested by prior administrations in trying to do this, but somehow or other, we've got to find a way to get China to rein in, probably the best we can hope for, the North Koreans.
Christine, can you address it as well? Because I think a lot of administrations have tried to get the Chinese to be more aggressive with the Koreans. North Koreans. There's always a question about how much influence they really are willing to wield. But also on this issue of again, administration, Republican and Democrat, have always vowed that North Korea would never become a nuclear power. Obviously, it has become, and the threat is not only regional to our allies, but also its proliferation threat. Is there something new we can do with North Korea to change the calculus there? Because whether it's the naivete, as Andrew says, of the Trump administration, but also policies of previous administration, nothing seems to be working there.
I do not think there are very many new tricks. I do not think there are very many new rabbits that can be pulled out of the hat to deal with the North Korea problem. I think the North Korea problem is something that the United States, with South Korea, Japan, and China and others, have to try to manage. But there is not there are not any new ideas that I have seen that seem very promising. I think we have to continue to, again, have through the trilateral alliance with Japan, South Korea, and the United States, have to demonstrate a credible military deterrent. I think we have to work with China to try to, sorry, someone's knocking on my door, probably the postman. We need to work to continue to put pressure and have the sanctions regime, remain strong. And that's where, China has kind of waxed and waned in terms of how helpful it can be. And there are some, it would be useful for the United States to be able to have the capability to detect better the location of North Korean nuclear weapons and all of their underground facilities and so on. But it's a very hard problem that I think we're just going to have to kind of keep slogging away on.
Let me, if I could, stick with you, Christine, unless you want to try to get your door there, and turn to, there's a couple questions here, and you raised this in one of your earlier remarks about the cyber threat. And I'll bundle together two of the questions on this. Do we have the right balance of priorities in terms of physical military, tanks, planes, ships, and investment in cyber? And then another question says, how will a shift in technological landscape and threats affect American defense priorities? So I guess if you can put those two together and talk a bit about cyber defense and also offensive cyber weapons, and how that may pull resources, or should pull resources, or should it pull resources from more traditional platforms that we talk about?
Yeah, I mean, I think we do, as I said, need to invest more in our cyber capabilities. we are, we've been focusing on them, I would say, for probably the last 5 to 7 years in a very serious way. We need to keep doing that. They are not as costly, obviously, as buying things like aircraft carriers and F-35. So I think, that's an area where perhaps we can get more bang for our buck, if you will, in terms of investments and how they result in terms of additions for our capabilities. But also, the cyber game is kind of a constant back and forth. I mean, as we get better, our adversaries get better. So it's not, I think, a domain where you can sort of rest on your laurels. But I think it's going to be a very, important dimension in military challenges in the future. And there's a lot of work to be done, I think, in terms of, again, understanding how artificial intelligence and other technological changes are going to, affect both, what we're able to do and what adversaries are able to do.
Andrew, can you take that up? Because I don't think you've addressed this yet, both how you view cyber as a potential threat, but also, frankly, what should we do about it? Is it something the U.S. should prepare or do more on cyber offensive capabilities? Is this something that we should be doing through the military, or are there other civilian agencies that should take care of this? Where do you see cyber playing into this? Oh, sorry, you're on mute again.
Obviously, you're not going to put me in charge of a cyber program. I can't even operate my own mute button. I have to confess, I don't know much about it. But it seems to me that one of the topics is kind of lurking in this conversation. And it goes back to the whole question of rebalancing. I mean, we're going to have a, $3 trillion deficit this year. I think there are estimates that we will continue to have multi-trillion-dollar deficits for the next several years. Mr. Biden, who I hope will prevail in the election, has promised to save the soul of America. I'm not quite sure what that means, but it sounds like a pretty ambitious undertaking. What are we going to do less of, I think, is the question. My very modest suggestion, one less thing we could do would be to guarantee the security of Europe. But I think there's that's an issue that deserves further exploration. I was involved in an event like this last week with a retired four-star. He happened to be an admiral, which is not insignificant based on what I'm going to say. And he was proposing that we make very substantial cuts in the size of the Army. But he wasn't saying that because he's an anti-Army guy. He was saying that because our Army is the largest service. It's a very expensive service. Going back to Christine's earlier point, that we are too quick to employ the military instrument. And his argument was smaller active Army, perhaps more robust reserve forces, means that you might have a chance of forcing a bigger national debate about when to intervene, where to intervene, and that would be both, arguably, make for more prudent policy, but also you could save a whole ton of money because by making your biggest service substantially smaller.
Last topic here, we're almost short on time. Question here about Iran, and the questioner puts it in sort of a dichotomy. Are we going the right direction, wrong direction type thing? The view of the questioner is by allying ourselves with the Gulf Arab states, obviously this deal with UAE and Bahrain, but also obviously the Saudis have been involved in this as well, as a sort of joint U.S.-Israeli Arab state offensive towards Iran. Is that the right path we are on right now, or? And Christine, I suspect I know where you're going to come down on this one. Should we have stuck in with the nuclear deal with the Iranians and tried to pull them into the international order? Andrew, you're off mute, so why don't I start with you on that one, and I'll ask Christine to wrap it up.
Oh well, I very much agree with that. I mean, if Christine's view is we should have stuck with the Iran nuclear deal, I'm with Christine on this, but I'll let her continue.
Christine, when I hit you in this, because obviously you were in the administration when this is being worked on, I guess the question is always with Iran. are they persuadable to participate in the family of nations? And obviously what we're seeing now is the Israelis have always opposed this. The Arab states were always very nervous about U.S. outreach towards the Iranians. And we're seeing sort of a phalanx between Jerusalem, Riyadh, and Washington on this. Is that the wrong path? And should we somehow try to bring Iran back into negotiations, again, part of the international order?
Well, I absolutely was a supporter of the Iran, nuclear deal, the JCPOA, and whether Iran can be persuaded to be a more benign and responsible actor in the international system, I don't know. But I do know that in terms of constraining Iran's nuclear weapons program, the Iran nuclear deal was better for the United States and for Israel and our other allies and partners in the Middle East than where we are now, where we, the maximum pressure campaign has not actually stopped the Iranian nuclear program. It hasn't stopped their, bad behavior in the region. They're actually, in the wake of the Soleimani strike, attacks from Iranian-supported militias in Iraq against U.S. forces have actually increased. So, I think we need to get Iran back to the negotiating table. We need to put constraints back around its nuclear weapons program and, maybe try to bring in a dialogue about their missile program. And maybe, somewhere in the future, years from now, we will have, we will see changes in Iranian society. But I feel like we have to be very hard-nosed about the actual threats, get that settled, and then, worry about trying to shape them in the world community, sort of farther down the road.
Unfortunately, that is all we have time for. Christine, Andrew, thank you very much. And thank you to the audience members for tuning in. Just to remind you that this American 2020 series is a series. This is just the kickoff one. Our next one will be on the U.S. and China. We moderated by one of my colleagues in Asia, James King, who's our China editor in Hong Kong. So please join us again for that. So thank you, everyone, for participating. And it was very enjoyable to me as well.
Thanks very much.